Another episode here of Getting There with Gods, where we talk about the career journeys of media members, coaches, athletes, business owners. And for this one, it has been quite the journey for this popular podcast. Frank Rossi, James Baker, JB, and Frank, we're going to refer to them in the interview as, are joining me in the huddle talking about D3 football, which I got to be honest, I talked to JB a little bit before we hit record. 14 years. 14 years this has been on. It's wild to think about it. But for those who may not be familiar with both of you, I'm going to start with James Baker, who, if you're watching our visual sides on the right side of the screen. James, I'll start with you. For those who aren't familiar, take us a little bit behind your background and how this show eventually started.
Well, I dabbled a little bit with D3 football as a player up at Hobart College, our respective alma mater. Me being a few years your senior, just a couple, I just became a big fan of Division III football through that experience. I was not a good player, but I knew what it was like to kind of go through that. How much dedication you have to have as a student athlete to basically play in front of your friends and family on, cold, October, November days in the upstate New York rain and weather. And then when Frank here started in the huddle with our friend Eric Wren, who was a former All-American offensive tackle for RPI, who I think I saw play against Hobart way back when. I was one of their first callers and started, throwing some stats at them, and eventually they brought me on as kind of like a behind the scenes producer type, and then eventually I think in season 2 or 3 Eric decided to sort of step away a little bit, and I became the co-host, and Frank's been putting up with me ever since. So it's just a passion that we both have to showcase the student athletes and some of the coaches in Division III, and it's been really fun because we went from a very upstate New York Liberty League, very small handful of schools, the Hobart-Union, RPI, so on and so forth. But it's expanded out to what was originally called the East Region, and now is Region 1 through 6. And we're talking to people in Texas and Washington State and Southern California and Alabama and Arkansas and all over the country. So it's been a really fun ride.
Frank, to you, same question, by the way, if you're watching our visual side. Frank is sandwiched in between our wonderful sponsors, Mohawk Honda, Johnstone Supply in Troy, Integrative Sleeps near JB, Northeastern Insurance is there. It feels like a weird addition to the Brady Bunch with 3 on. But Frank, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background.
I couldn't think of better things to be sandwiched between, to be honest with you guys. But as long as I get what's on this side, perhaps it would be great. But anyway. In 2008, Eric Wren and I kind of were tossing around this idea we'd been talking about for a little while. This podcasting thing was new. D3football.com was about a year into their podcast. We were like, we have a following on the message board, so why don't we try to do something with it? And I was in Miami going back to school for a year down there. So that was my way to stay attached to Division III, even though I was in Miami, Florida. And I got an anecdote about this later. I was thinking about it. So I was driving back up to upstate New York today. But first, I would get back and forth a couple times in the season for Union games, but we concentrated on that podcast, and we had the committee chairperson join us for the first time really ever to have a live interview about how the selection process occurred. A lot of people were interested in that. Our numbers flew off for that one. And we saw gradually we had a following. And what we learned over time, and especially in the last year, to fast forward now that we went to video a few years ago and everything else, is that the element that people like about us is that we've sort of offered a human side to Division III football, because we already knew that Division III football isn't where you're going to go play for the Bucks necessarily, or the Giants or the Jets or what have you. But it's there for you to continue your love of the game. And, how many people get drafted out of Division III? One every few years, maybe. And then free agent signings afterward, maybe a couple more. This isn't about that. But what we've done is we've taken, the stories, the names, the gameplay, and sort of brought guys who might not get the focus the same way a Division I, FBS or FCS player would get, and give them that level of focus and attention, and the coaches for that matter, because you know what? They ain't making bank doing this. They're making a good amount of money if they've been there for a while, I'm sure, but A lot of these schools, especially in New England, there used to be a lot of part-time positions as head coaches. They've done better with that over the last decade or so, but still, they're doing it as much for the love of the game and hope for maybe career track later on. But to bring the players, to bring the coaches up front like that, they have loved us for doing that, and the families have loved us in turn. So that's kind of where our passion is. We really do concentrate on the student athlete interviews to the degree we can, and also humanize the coaches to the degree we can, like Kevin Gilmartin this weekend at Salve Regina, who lost his father a couple of weeks ago. Just being able to bring that story to folks and even show just the helmet with the decal of Poppy, which was his dad's name, on the helmet that they wore this week in his honor. To be able to bring that to folks that wouldn't otherwise know the story, it's just very incredible and humbling for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's truly remarkable. Go ahead, JB.
And I was going to say, I'm Frank isn't going to give himself the credit for it, but the fact that he figured out a way to present this in a video format, we were basically doing, Skype interviews like this, back in 2017, 2018, before the pandemic, before it was kind of a commonplace thing. It allowed us to get in touch with certain schools and places that we physically, I'm down here in Florida, Frank's, bouncing back between upstate and Manhattan. And so, it opened up a whole new avenue, and for especially for small college, there's almost literally zero television or video coverage. I mean, you get the national broadcast of the Stag Bowl in mid-December by ESPN and their fifth string announcers that don't even know how to pronounce the names of the schools. But this provided an avenue, and certain segments like our Crunch Time highlight show, like we have almost like a Sports Center type of presentation now, thanks to Frank's work and the video editing. I don't know how to do all that heavy lifting. I'm kind of more of the comic relief, guy, but that's just one of the few things that I bring. But Frank really has done an awesome job, kind of digitizing this and making Division III sports just like a regular TV show medium that you just don't get to see anywhere else.
Well, you truly are a veteran statesman, because you were thinking the same thing I was thinking about, this evolution of podcasting in general and what has changed in this. And I'm going to turn to Frank on this because, like, you've seen this build. You've both touched on how important it is that it's almost underappreciated, or maybe not even understood, that this D3 football following is really big, because these rosters of players can really be in comparison larger than FBS and FCS because of the non-scholarships and those who may have decided not to continue to finish their careers for whatever reason. It might be academically, injury, whatever. But that must be the most thing you guys at times, besides learning these human stories and finding about these backgrounds, but watching what this has been built from year 1 to year 14 for you guys.
There's 25,000 players, we estimate, because there used to be 250 schools in Division III. Now we're down to 239 post-COVID, some teams just elevating too. Yeah, so there are a variety of reasons why we've lost 11 schools or football programs over the last few years. But if you do the math, it's about 25,000 student athletes in Division III football. And as you said, it's the largest division for any D1, D2, NAIA, anybody out there. So, yeah, when we started, it was just essentially the 7 or 8 schools of the Liberty League that we were handling. So, okay, 700, 800 people, plus their families and, the alumni, and that exposure was great. Then to the East region, it was about 62 schools, give or take, I think it was. So maybe another, up to about 7,500 was your audience. Now with this audience, it's tough in some ways, because where do you draw the line in terms of your coverage level? And we always tell a story, and to stay with the subject that's on the screen down there, when people come to us asking us about starting a podcast, the biggest thing I always say, guys, is find a niche, stick to the niche, don't overreach from the niche, because as long as the niche you have is something people want to, look at you, you're ready for everything. Yeah, but as long as the niche is something that people want to hear about, they're going to find you. And so we did that for a while. But then when the Liberty League was shrinking down to 6 teams for a little while because of teams exiting and everything else going on, we had a crossroads moment, because we were audio. We're getting hyper-focused now, losing a school. What do we do? And the bounce there was to go to 10, in season 10, go to the video and expand to the East region. And we had some growing pains doing that, because we couldn't figure out where to draw the line there. So the whole thing I'm trying to get at here is this. Still today, for the best podcast approach, find your niche, stick with the niche, embrace that niche for a while until you can't do that anymore, and then begin to figure out kind of methodically what you can do to get to that next step. But don't overreach. There are 1,000, really more than that probably, guys out there trying to do the all sports thing. And as well as anybody after your story and everything and trying to get to the podcasting range, it's tough to compete out there with these generalists that are out there. And you're doing a great job trying to kind of focus here, focus there, and make sure you have a bunch of different niches hit in separate shows. Some guys try to pack it into one show. Big mistake. It's not going to work in this day and age unless you really have an ESPN type of backing.
Yeah, and I would just add too that you have to be a little flexible and sort of forward thinking, because the reality is, while our Facebook channel is really sort of the meat and potatoes of what we've been serving for the last few seasons, and it's great. It's a great platform, and it's certainly one that parents of the current players are very familiar with, because they are most likely, in their early 50s, give or take. And that's if you want to joke around about the boomer thing, you can, but whatever. It is something that gears very well towards that audience. And we're obviously catering to a certain extent to that parent audience. But eventually, we, 14 years in, we've talked to guys who are now, Jimmy Robertson, for instance, the head coach of FDU Florham, he was the first guest on In the Huddle. He's now, married, a couple of kids, in his early 40s. He might still use Facebook a little bit, but all the other kids that have kind of come after him that have been on the show throughout to the decade of the 2010s probably aren't real Facebook users. So we eventually might have to try to find a different sort of social media platform, whether it's Instagram Live or this and that. You have to sort of just kind of roll with it and see how it goes. I mean, in certain levels, it seems like our audience, even though it's bigger, we're not having the same exact numbers with all our shows, but we're also, we're doing stuff on Twitter, we're doing stuff on Instagram. Like, it's so much more spread out. I imagine the aggregate and the fact that, Frank goes on the road to these games and he's like a celebrity, they roll out the red carpet. Yeah. It's a whole thing. So on one hand, it's like, okay, well, what we're doing seems to be working well. And, who knows with the numbers, they're probably better than they've ever been. I don't really, look at that too closely or care, but it's just one of those things. I know eventually, we probably will have to pivot and find something different, because Facebook may or may not always be around in 5 or whatever years.
Yeah, there's so many good things you just said there. I think especially for a new podcast user, I'll start with the numbers thing first. Yeah, don't get discouraged, because whatever that number is that you set as your baseline, you can go back and hit refresh 10 times and 15. Don't worry about it. If you have an intense audience, you have people who care about the product, if you have sponsors who want to have your backs, and you guys keep grinding at it, this is just anybody who's listening who's starting a podcast, you guys have lived it, it's going to work out. You mentioned JB parents, which I found very interesting, because I know for so many podcast listeners, they might think, well, somebody who's older than 50 doesn't know what a podcast is. But hearing that they will seek you guys out and find it, it's very encouraging for 2021. And I'm going to toss this question to your way, JB, about feedback from listeners, because you mentioned Frank feels like a celebrity at times when he shows up. But I know when I played, and I was a former guest on your guys' podcast, there were times what you guys said in the podcast and predictions was bulletin board, because nobody would have been giving coverage to Hobart and Utica or RPI, where all of a sudden players are like, uh-oh, they picked against us. Like, how did that feel initially for you guys? Were you getting feedback not just from listeners and parents, but maybe even players that are getting a little ticked off that you're picking against the team?
One of my favorite moments in our show's history was when Frank picked against Endicott by like a really bad margin. And the Gulls went and they won that game by like 40 points. Like, they just creamed I don't even remember who they were playing. It was from a couple of seasons ago. We heard so much from the different like players and their parents and, fans of that school.
Becker, which doesn't even exist anymore. Becker College. It's no longer in existence.
Yeah. So, and I've certainly, I'll probably, ruffle a few feathers this week. I'm sure we'll get around to talking about the Union Hobart game. I don't always pick Hobart, and that sometimes surprises people when I do that. So, the best part about the the listeners' feedback that I can recall. I mean, at this point we've done, was it like 312 episodes and counting so far, it's the stories and getting to hear about the individual student athletes and their families, and just the really sincere, thanks and gratitude that we kind of get behind the scenes. And I think it's given us a certain amount of credibility with leaders of institutions. The NCAA trusts us, I think, with certain information and certain events and things. So that's really made it worthwhile, and to feel like you're making a positive impact and giving someone who's otherwise just playing the game because they love football, gives them a little extra 15 minutes of recognition is really special.
Frank, that same question to you. The passionate college football fans, doesn't matter it's FBS to D3, I'm sure, just like JB just said, you've felt it, not just from Endicott, but from other people throughout this 14-year journey.
This one in particular, actually, RPI, is a long road coming because Coach Isernia used to tell us happily he would post us as his bulletin board material when I was on, especially D3Football.com, but I would carry over the picks onto our show against RPI. And then other guys on D3 Football were doing the same thing, and he was just having a field day making us that. And eventually he challenged me because he was like, I don't think you and JB will wear any RPI stuff because Hobart-Union, obviously the triumvirate and arch rivals, but during this whole families being left out of the ECAV stadium for RPI thing, we bleed red for them in this respect. So there's that. I was on the road a couple of weeks ago, accidentally landed at Catholic at WPI because of traffic issues getting up to, of all places, Endicott. So I'm cursed with Endicott. From this week, they lose to Salve Regina. So me and Endicott, I don't know what's going to happen there. But Catholic beats WPI, and Coach Catelius tells me off camera, and I share this, probably shouldn't, but I find it humorous. Hey, I hope you don't mind. I used you as bulletin board material this week with my team about being an upstart team. And I'm like, everybody else does it. Why the hell would I be upset about this? I mean, come on, man.
Yeah.
So it's daunting at first. And the backlash with Endicott actually was funny on Twitter to see the players basically dig out the archive footage of me saying what I had to say from Twitter and said things like, oh, this didn't age well, or what are you talking about, man? And our response was to make it our cold open the next time. And you have to sit there and have your own sense of humor about it, because if you don't don't have that thick skin, you're really not going to make it in this whole situation. And so over my 26 years almost,
26, I think,
broadcasting and being a face or voice out in front, eventually I formed that thick skin. It was tough the first few years because you start to take it a little personally. Then you realize, you know what, the hell of it. Okay, I'm going to be a moving target no matter what, but I'm still doing the right things along the way. And if they're using me as that moving target, then obviously they're listening to me for some reason. They're listening to JB for some reason as well. And that's what you got to remember.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, as long as you're honest and and you admit when you're right and when you're wrong, it's no big deal. I mean, it's one of those things. That's the beauty of football games. Like, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose, and if you call the wrong team, then as long as you eat the little bit of the crow that you get served for it, it's all good.
That's exactly it. If you did your research, you put the effort into it, you didn't, half-ass the effort. You say, hey, I thought this team was going to win for X, Y, and Z reason, and they didn't. You shrug your shoulders and be like, you guys proved me wrong. Good for you guys. You flap it, you tip the cap, and you move on. Frank, this is a question for both of you. I want to start with you on this one. It seems in particular like at least the last 8 to 9 seasons, you could make an argument. It's almost been like a glory era for upstate New York D3 football. You've had teams like RPI, Alfred, St. John Fisher, Brockport, Hobart twice get to the Elite Eight over the last 8 seasons. Do you feel as if this is almost a glory era the last decade for upstate New York D3 football?
I want to reach back a little bit deeper than just the last 7 or 8 years. I want to go back to Fisher, because RPI had their stint in the semifinals back about 15 years ago or so. It was
2003 or something. It was a while back.
So it's a while. Yeah, it was like 2003, 2004, whichever it was.
RPI didn't get to 2019? I thought they might have snuck in there. It might be on me. I thought they snuck in within the last 5 years to Elite Eight.
Not the RPI, but Brockport did,
Okay.
actually. So we did have that. And so I want to lead with St. John Fisher. St. John Fisher sort of did the design, I would say, of the Upstate New York team and how to get there, how to get that deep into the playoff run. Coach Fosberg, his team used to be kind of a laughing stock of sorts in terms of win-loss record. But what he was doing in the process of all this was scheduling the RPIs, scheduling all these really tough teams.
The Mount Unions.
What are you doing? Yeah. Well, eventually they would play Mount Union and then schedule Mount Union after the playoff run they had. But that was the design and recipe for success. Don't be afraid in the out-of-conference games to take the reaches out there, to travel somewhere and play a team you might not otherwise see to get better with it. And as we see over the last, especially 6 years, Brockport seemed to have that same design and got better from that with Coach Mangoni and company, especially at the helm. And getting a guy like Joe Germinario with local ties here as well from Troy, just building in that manner, schedule well, recruit well, go out and take some chances, take some risks, and you'll be pleased with the results. Now look at Ithaca. Now look at RPI. Now look at Hobart. Look at Union. Union went down to Louisiana, of all places, to get Will Bellamy and Will Sermon, his receiver, as well. Look at even Salve Regina, just for getting out of New York for a second, but this was something I'll tie back to New York in a second. Salve Regina, I interview a safety from Belen Jesuit down in Miami, Florida. Remember, no Division III college football teams in the state of Florida. 2 weeks earlier, Gabe, whose last name I'm forgetting right now, sorry, Gabe, he was a defensive back for Catholic from Belen Jesuit down in Miami, Florida. And I thought about this morning as I was putting together our interviews on Twitter. I was like, the hell's going on here? This is the same school, 2 years separated, I think they were.
Yeah.
But why are, in Newport, Rhode Island and Washington, D.C., are these guys coming up to play football? And the answer is guys like John Audino at Union before Coach Bierman were actually going down there and recruiting the hell out of Florida because they realized not every player in the state of Florida can come to a Division I program. It's just not enough programs out there for them. So eventually they made inroads with Division III programs. Union began to do that, and so have some of the upstate New York teams as well. And that imprint of going outside your comfort zone has become a big part of this whole New York renaissance as you're kind of looking at it as well. So, RPI goes out to California. Andrew Franks was a California guy, and I talked to Coach Isernia the other day. He was touting a guy that I interviewed who he went out to talk to him out in California, and then went to Chavez Ravine to see Dodgers game right after that. So, I mean, you see what's going on. There is a certain, let's break out of this box of New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and maybe even Pennsylvania and see what else is out there in this country, and it's working.
JB, you feeling the same ways on Frank's take there about the change that's happened in New York?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think that the, just given when you look at sort of the national demographics, I mean, there are less kids going to college now than there ever been. It's declining, especially boys. Most schools are starting to shift to 60-40 female to male ratios. So for schools that need to bring in some more guys, college football is a great way to do it. I mean, we've seen programs out there like Hendricks down in Arkansas. I mean, they started their program up 10 years ago with a pretty explicit reason that they needed to, bring about 100 and 150 more men on campus. And it's worked out for them. They've turned into a strong program in the Southeast. And, to Frank's point, I think that there are a lot of states down here in the South where, not everybody, is going to go to Florida State or UF or UCF, for instance. And, most high school football players can't play football there, but they can play football at a Hobart or a Union or an RPI. And it's kind of expanding that, that knowledge base and really kind of being creative and looking for pockets in the country where they, you can hit on the, do strong in school. They're athletic enough to compete. And number three, which sometimes is almost the biggest factor in the equation, that these schools, many of them are private and have fairly substantial endowments, can figure out ways to financially make it work for these kids and their families. Maybe it's not a D1 scholarship, but if you have a strong academic record and you can get an institutional grant or some other type of academic scholarship, an expensive school all of a sudden becomes a pretty good value.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with what's going to happen in the next 2 to 4 years, in particular post-COVID, where a lot of these athletes who may have projected themselves to be FBS or FCS players, they may say an injury, a bad game, a recruiting, whatever it might be, that opportunity where they projected themselves to be at a higher level, they might jump to the D3 route and maybe transfer up or just play for a couple seasons or finish it off because they like the school. I'm fascinated to see what the talent is going to be, hopefully in New York as well, over the next 2 to 4 years because of what COVID has done to the recruiting landscape. All right, let's talk about this matchup coming up this weekend. Union, Hobart, both programs truly in great spots. Kickoff Saturday, 1 o'clock, Schenectady. There comes the U on Frank's hat right there. James, I'm going to start with you before we actually get to the X's and O's and the players and there's the H. I love this. This is exactly why I wanted you guys on this week. I'm loving this. I want to start with you, though, James, first, because I think as far as you go back, for those who may not be as familiar with the Hobart program, kind of take us through what's changed. What was Hobart maybe 20 years ago, and what does the program look like now in 2021?
Well, 20 years ago, Hobart was chasing Union. They were trying to, get to Union's level because Coach Audino had been so successful. He and his predecessor had, been to the Stag Bowl in the late 80s, and they were national title contenders in the 90s. And they used to beat Hobart on a very consistent basis for a very long time period. In the early 2000s, though, after Coach Craig took over for the Statesman after the passing of Coach Bill Maxwell, Craig started, to try to ramp up some recruiting. And over time, Hobart made the NCAA playoffs for the first time in the year 2000. And then they made it again in 2002. And then, they started to have some success and, built themselves up to what I would say, was a Union level by the middle of the 2000s. And then, I think it was a combination of factors, not only with Craig as a leader, but he brought in some guys, former players of his, like Kevin DeWall, who's the current head coach of Hobart, like Scott Yoder, who's the current head coach of Shenandoah University down in Virginia. And he had this core of assistant coaches with him for about 8 or 9 year run. And that's when you saw kind of the combination of factors that led to that 41-5 run with the, Ali Marpet senior class that led them to so much success in the mid 2010s. And, at the same time, Union had, it's almost kind of the opposite. Coach Audino didn't really get the support from the college. The Division I hockey thing at Union kind of derailed football among other athletic programs. And so for a while, there was a little bit of an imbalance. I think nowadays, though, Coach Behrman's new to Union. Kevin is quote unquote new to Hobart. He'd been there a long time, coordinator, but he's in his third year as head coach. So not really a new face in the picture, but once this game this weekend will be another huge upstate rivalry game. It's Union's homecoming. They're undefeated, ranked number 12 in the country. They're riding a 20-game regular season win streak. And Hobart's looking to play spoiler because if they lose this game, their season is basically over. They're not going to the postseason. So huge game, huge stakes. It should be a huge crowd, great atmosphere. I know a lot of Hobart alums are making the trip up. I really wish I can, but family commitments down here in Florida probably will prevent it. But it's going to be an awesome atmosphere, and I'm sure it'll be a great game.
Yeah, Frank.
Let me add one thing, guys. I just want to say something about that, what you just said. The one person of all people that invited him to come up and was sort of inducing the guilt complex on this.
Yeah.
Bill Bellamy, senior quarterback at Union College. He's like, JB, I don't want this to be just a virtual friendship because over the years you make friends with a lot of these players. Of all. And, at different schools, even the schools that are against your place. Made friends with RPI guys over time. Jimmy Robertson, as he said, for instance. So Will Bellamy, of all people, is the one who was like, Flights are cheap right now. Come up for this game by all means. And JB, we're still challenging you on this. If there's a way to do it, get your butt up here, and I'll stay around for this game this weekend. Come on.
Come on, make it happen. You know, I would have said, I think I might have told this to one of you guys before. I lived on Park Avenue for a few years when I moved here to the Capital Region. So that's right on the corner. I can basically walk into the end zone for where I lived for about 2 years there in Schenectady. So I do have more of an appreciation. I don't want people from Geneva to throw stuff at me. I appreciate Union College more because of how beautiful it does look in the fall. But JB did a great job with the history of that. So Frank, I kind of turned to, over the last couple of years, why Union has now become a nationally ranked program. What are the changes within the Dutchman that you think has now put this team in the top tier of New York teams in D3 and across the country?
There's the thought here, and JB touched on it, that once the D1 hockey imbalance internally was occurring, because when they grandfathered those schools in, like the Hobarts, the St. Lawrence's, Clarkson, even though not football, Hopkins, et cetera, that have Division I sports and Division III programs, they never did what they probably should have done, which was put a wall between the resources so that the Division I sport and the Division III sports weren't at odds with each other in the budget or personnel-wise or resource-wise or whatever. That never happened. And so there is this thought, when you have a Division I hockey program, you've got a piece of gold there that you need to cultivate. And the old administration at Union didn't necessarily feel that way. They liked being on the same marquee as Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, Colgate, Cornell, etc. But they were content with being kind of a basement dweller. And if you had a good season, great. You'll get the excitement connected with it. As things changed, people changed their philosophies on it. They went to 2 Frozen Fours, won one of them, in fact. And that sort of, I think, as things turn there and you see the football program kind of in the basement suddenly for a few years, you begin to realize, well, maybe we need to rejigger this the other way a little bit again. And then you bring in a guy like Jeff Behrman, who, you know, I was a critic of how Union handled John Audino back when, but that's not anything against Jeff Behrman. He wanted a job. He qualified for the job. He's a good coach.
He's done a great job.
Bring him in. Good. So what he did was, as I suggested, he sort of went beyond the boundaries that even John Audino was going out in. Although we did have some Louisiana players from past years, but just Jared Gourier is one that jumps to mind, who was a quarterback, then converted a little bit to more of a running player. But he broadened that out, and he brought a good resume that players believed in along the way. And Bellamy is one of those guys that bought into him and is thrilled to have bought in. And the relationship they have is always interesting because, they always joke around with Coach Behrman. You got more gray hairs this year, Coach. Is Bellamy doing it to you again? And, he jokes back, oh, absolutely. But it's a great relationship. And the Andre Ross Jr.'s of the world and Ike Erebor, I mean, he's gotten some great skill players. But beyond the skill players, you look at what those lines have become over the last couple of years, especially a couple of seasons, and you realize that the key to success is those lines, especially up front for the offense. And he's been able to make that happen with some bigger, better play, I think, over the last couple of years than we saw in the prior decade. And that's what's going on, I think, at Union, that they've gotten a better recruiting base again, gotten more resources back into the system, and given Coach Behrman the opportunity to succeed. Just because you give him the resources doesn't mean he would, but because he's that guy, he can and has with his coaching staff.
All right, not one, but 2 predictions I'm going to ask for you guys. 2 predictions here. One for the weekend game, so for Union Hobart. And Frank, I'm going to start with you. Take us through what you think is going to happen in the game. And then the second one is, there could be someone listening to this podcast for the first time who maybe doesn't have a D3 football rooting interest. They don't have a team, but they want to root for the New York team. So again, Union Hobart winner and what happens, and give us the New York team you think can go the furthest in the NCAA playoffs, and how far, what is the potential of that team? So 2-part question for you. And Frank, I'll start with you.
I saw Hobart play up close and personal when they faced Ithaca at Butterfield. And I saw a team that's got some great skill players indeed. Rayshon Boswell, for instance, the ironic name of Hobart, as you know. He's just an awesome player. David Cruson, I think, is an interesting quarterback. Ithaca's mistake, I think, was daring him too much to beat him with his arm. And at certain points in that game, he brought them back by doing so. He succeeded in that. And eventually, though, as he needed to bring him back one more time, it just didn't work out. But he got him darn close a couple of times late in that game. Since that point, they've had 2 games they've had to win in cardiac fashion against RPI and then St. Lawrence of all teams this past week. So Hobart can win close games, but they can also lose close games. On the flip side, Union, who's played a lesser schedule than Hobart, I would say this season, overall, at least to this point, is not used to that. And so I feel like Union has to distance themselves. They haven't, had these close games down the stretch, except for maybe this Springfield game where they had a chance at the end of the game. But they've usually had a 2-possession lead, maybe shrinks back to a possession at halftime, and then eventually put distance between them and the other team. But they haven't had one of those up and down the field shootout scenarios. So I don't think that bodes well for Union, but I think having had this Rochester game this past weekend where they were able to jump out and stay out in front, they finally know how to get that distance between themselves and a team that's a decent team. Rochester's decent this year. And so I think Union wins because they're able to get 2 early touchdowns in this game, or at least a 2-touchdown lead, and hang on in the game to win probably somewhere in the vicinity of 30-21 in this game. And as for the best team in New York, the team that can go the furthest right now, personally, even though it's not ranked this way on my ballot because I still want to see more evidence for it, Cortland is my answer to that. They are just clicking like no other time I've seen Cortland in the last decade, with Breeze Segala as their quarterback, who is the brother of Brett Segala, who was the wonderkin under center before him. And so he's seen what Brett has had to learn along the way as quarterback. And when they fell behind against Brockport, it looked like they didn't even worry about it. In the second half, they just surged ahead and never looked back. That was an impressive victory by them. And being the state school they are, they obviously have some big bodies that might not get to other schools in the state. It's just the way it is, okay? It's a state school, and they have that ability to draw in guys like that. Brockport, say the same thing about them over the last few years. Cortland is one to watch here.
The Red Dragon fans are happy about that answer. All right, JB, over to you. Same questions this weekend and overall for the future. What are we looking at?
Well, the best part of us having to reschedule this from the original time that we were going to talk, it gave me like an hour to sort of dig into the statistics between these 2 teams. So I actually feel like I've educated myself. and at the end of the day, guys, the big difference I would say is that, from a quarterback and receiver perspective, Union has a clear advantage. I mean, Hobart's wide receiver core is pretty green. And, let's face it. I mean, Bellamy's probably one of the best quarterbacks in what's now referred to as Region 2. It used to be called the East Region. It's that's sort of D3 minutia, but he's got the highest efficiency ranking in the league. He's just a really talented player, and so I don't think, especially given the fact that Hobart has shot themselves in the foot with averaging about 80 yards of penalties a game, about 8 to 10 penalties per game, turnovers, and Crusen's just inconsistency with passing the ball, and some of it's not his fault. A lot of his passes have been dropped. I just think when you kind of compare some of the skill positions, I think running back is a push. Irabor is obviously great, and he had an awesome game against Hobart in 2019. He ran for almost 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. I think the linebacking core of Hobart will do a better job of keeping him in check. And then ultimately it'll go back to what Frank was saying with the lines. And Hobart's offensive line is good, but a little inexperienced. Their defensive line is a little banged up. Emmett Ford, the All-American outside linebacker, should have, some sacks, but I know that Union likes to use a max protect, so they'll have somebody on 22. Ultimately, I think Union's just going to kind of outlast the Statesmen and win like 31-17.
All right. And who's going the deepest? What team's going to make that run? Are you with the Cortland bandwagon, or somebody else going to shock and maybe make a deep run?
I think, I'll hedge my bet a little bit. I think the winner of Cortica, if they finish the season 10-0, will have the best opportunity because they will have a chance at likely being ranked as a number 2 seed potentially in whichever bracket that they get set in, most likely with a Mount Union or something like that, realistically. So if Union runs the table and beats Cortland and Corsica, they will be set up nicely. They'll get a very winnable first round game and then have a chance to advance, pretty far into the tournament. Same thing with Cortland. If they beat Ithaca at the end of the season, and they'll have a little bit of an easier ride because Ithaca's still got to play Union. They still have to play RPI, so they might be a little more well-rested and not as banged up. So I agree with Frank. I think Cortland is probably the pick, but it could easily be Ithaca if they're able to hang on and win Corsica.
It has been awesome having you guys on for Hobart Union Week. For those who've enjoyed the talk and the conversation, JB, I'm going to let you get the plugs in. Where can people find In the Huddle?
Well, you can find us on our Facebook channel, in the D3FB Huddle. We have a new Instagram account. We're sort of dabbling with that, at D3FB Huddle. Our Twitter accounts are at D3FB Huddle, and then you can also follow Frank at Frank Rossi on Twitter as well. One of the things that's been really cool this year with all of Frank's road trips that he's done, he posts the interviews post game with coaches and players. Those are getting thousands of views, and it's been really fun to sort of add that little wrinkle into things. And I tell you what, guys, if Frank does show up for Hobart Union, he has about a 90% average of every game he goes to is decided by a touchdown or less. Like every game that Frank's been going to have been close games, including Salve, Endicott, and so we'll see if he ends up there. Could be a closer one than we think.
Okay, all right, we'll find out. That could be the swing in the game. It's very possible that could happen.
It all could depend on Frank. So maybe
right.
The Union fans may not want him to show up because that would mean it would be a close game.
Frank, we'll see what type of power you have when it comes to that. Keep an eye out for that guy. We'll see what he can do. Guys, thank you so much for doing this. It's been awesome catching up with you. It's been a decade plus since we did this in this type of format. The world has changed a lot. Technology's changed. So keep up the great work. Looking forward to talking to you guys and staying in touch for the future.
You two guys. Thanks a lot.
Great work. Keep up the great work in the Capital Region. We need you to stay to the degree you can, and we love what you do out here.
Appreciate it, man.